The Gemara in two locations tells us, cites a verse from Echo, which we read, that's the scroll we read on Tisha B'Av, which was authored by Yirmiyah, Jeremiah the prophet, who witnessed the destruction of the first temple. And he explains over there, this is part of a prophecy, that the reason why the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, al ozvom es Torasi, because they abandoned my Torah. That's the reason why it was destroyed. So I asked the question. The Gemara tells us in one location that the reason why the first temple was destroyed is because they violated the three cardinal sins, not because they abandoned the Torah. So how do we reconcile both of these statements in the Gemara? One location says because they violated three cardinal sins, and the other one says because they did not study Torah properly, which is the equivalent of the abandonment of the Torah. So the way we explained was this. The Gemara tells us in a number of locations that what's the only antidote to the evil inclination, which incapacitates it, which brings a level of clarity that's only the study of the Torah itself. But it's not just ordinary Torah study. You have to study Torah with the right intention. And if you study the Torah with the right intention, which is not, we're not talking about abstract intellectualism, but rather it's infused with a purpose and a value. You study it to be able to actualize it, to fulfill it properly. Plus you have the right intention, then it brings about a spiritualization, a sense, as we said, you're able to internalize its values. And as a result of that, you're able to discern between good and evil, because it's more than abstract knowledge. It's not, I know it's wrong, I feel it's wrong. Therefore, as a result of not studying Torah properly, abandoning the Torah, you've lost your sense of spirituality. Therefore, as I say, it's a slippery slope. You could ultimately be in violation of the three cardinal sins. Because you say, why not? And you're subject to all levels of influence. That's how I reconciled the two statements in these two locations. Why did we fall to the level of idolatry, adultery, and murder? Because we lost our sense of our spirituality, because we've not studied Torah as we should have studied it. Therefore, we lived as physical beings, like intellectual animals. So as an animal could be a predator, a human being could also be a predator. I always say, an animal which is a predator is not as dangerous as a human being who's a predator. Why? Because an animal, the way it functions as a predator, it's within the parameters of its DNA. A lion behaves like a lion, tiger like a tiger, a leopard like a leopard, each one. So if you study the behavior of each one of these species, you know exactly how to be protected from it, because they always behave a certain way. Each one is unique to its own profile of whatever it is. A human being, if a human being chooses to be a predator, that means that human being is not limited to any profile. So what keeps check on a human being? His conscience. If you have no conscience, you don't know where that person's coming from. He could come at you from many directions that you wouldn't even believe. Therefore, as a human being, the moment you lose conscience, you have no conscience, that human predator is worse than an animal, which is innately a predator. Because the innateness of a human being is not a predator. It's only due to choice. Could you hold just one moment? So what gives us that acuteness of sense of right and wrong? The study of Torah. That's the antidote to the evil inclination. As a result of that, you don't cross many lines. But if you go and you compromise and you don't study the Torah and you abandon it, then you become
subject and influenced, that ultimately can even lead to the three cardinal sins. That's how I reconcile both statements in the Gemara, in the Talmud. The Maral explains, why is Torah called Torah? Why is it called Torah? The appellation Torah is used. It's a verse in the Torah. Torah Tzivilot of Moshe. That's the first verse you teach a child when you begin speaking. Torah Tzivilot of Moshe, Marosha Kilas Yaakov. Torah was commanded us by Moshe. It is the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. That's a verse in the Torah. It's Torah. Said Maral explains, the root of the word of Torah is lahoros. Lahoros means to give direction. What is Torah supposed to do? That is the guiding light in a Jew's life. So that means it's not just studying its intellectualism. It's actually using it as a means to be able to actualize and assume a behavior pattern, how to behave, ethics, values, morals, everything. That's Torah. It's Mora Derech. It gives us a direction of what path to walk and what to achieve and what to aspire for. But that's only if you're studying it to actualize. That's called Limud Lame. Limud Lame Lasos. You're studying it Lasos to actualize it. But if that element is missing, it's no longer Torah. It's wisdom, but it's not Torah. Barasi Eitzabarasi Torah Tavli. If it's Torah, it's an antidote. It's not Torah, it doesn't incapacitate. It doesn't bring around that level of illumination because there's no spiritualization, because spiritualization comes through the actualization and the fulfillment of the mitzvahs themselves, where your physicality is engaged in doing the dictates of the Torah, whether it's tefillin, whether it's kashrus, whether it's Shabbos, whether it's what we see, what we speak, that impacts and touches us, and that spiritualizes us. The law is that, and it's based on a verse in Malachi, which is the prophets, one of the prophets, that what kind of teacher should you choose to teach yourself Torah? He has to be Doma L'Malcha Hashem Tzvados. He has to have a semblance of an angel. And therefore, the Rambam rules that if a teacher has certain corrupt views, heretical views about Judaism, he could be the greatest genius in the world. You're not permitted to study from that person. But it'll give you the most advanced level of understanding of the Talmud. And he's not teaching you philosophy. He's only teaching you Talmud. You're not permitted to study from him. There's a negative command which we just read. It's called, in the Torah last week's reading, Lo Sechonim. So the Talmud has a number of interpretations. That's a Torah violation. Lo sitlem chani ba'aretz. You're not permitted to sell property in Israel to a non-Jew. After we removed them from Israel, I mean, they retook it. But if we retake possession, you're not permitted to sell property to a non-Jew. Lo sitlem chani ba'aretz. Don't give him any inhabitants in the land. Also, lo sitlem matnas chinam. You're not permitted to give a gift to a non-Jew unless you have reason to. If it's that there's a gain to you by currying favor or relationship, you're permitted. But just give a gift for gift's sake, you're not permitted. Also, you're not permitted to praise them. You're not permitted to praise a Gentile. Why? What's the reason for this? So Rambam explains, says something very interesting. If I go to you and ask you, I said, I need a doctor who's the best in his area of expertise. You're permitted to explain to me exactly why he's the best doctor. So although simultaneously you're praising him to the hilt because you're actually identifying his ability and his record, but since it's for a purpose that I need a referral and to identify who that person is permitted. What about you still want to praise him for the sake of praising him?
I read about this doctor. He's amazing. And this, thank God you're healthy. And you just want to speak about his qualities and his ability and his selflessness. You're not permitted. Why aren't you permitted? It's very interesting. A human being is the most impressionable species that walks the face of the earth. Whatever we're impressed with, we gravitate towards that person and we become impressionable because of that. Let's say if a person, let's talk about a heretic. He has many good qualities, but he has this streak of heresy in him. If you study from him, two things happen. The teachings, if you're studying from that same person, may be somehow tainted with that heretical bent, which you don't even realize. It's so subliminal, you don't even realize and even the teacher, he doesn't mean to teach you heresy, but that's just part and parcel of what his perception, his belief may be. It comes through. That's why you're not permitted to study from a heretic, regardless of what his Torah knowledge may be. Because simultaneously, he may be at some level communicating some of that bad stuff with the good stuff. Therefore, you can't study. When a non-Jew, in terms of what he represents, we're not saying it's bad, but the qualities, the beliefs of what he is not a Jew. If you esteem him and revere him, it's inevitable you take the full ball of wax. It's to take the totality. So not only are you esteeming and revering what you're permitted to, it's the totality of the person. When you revere the totality of the person, and since there's a certain element representation, which is not appropriate for a Jew because of his beliefs, what he represents, his values, as a result of that, you can't praise him. Because if you praise him, ultimately that means you esteem him. You put him on a pedestal. He becomes a model in your life. As a result of that, you become impressed by him. Therefore, you're not permitted. That's the provision, that you're not permitted to praise a non-Jew just for the sake of praise. I'll share with you a story. Many years ago, this is 1965. And he's a very good friend of mine till today. This person is today, he's turning 77 soon. And he came from London. And he was a not a Baal Tshuva, but not a yeshiva student type. He completed his first year of university in London. He came to Baltimore to study in the yeshiva because he had a relative who lived in Chicago who encouraged him to come because what was available here is not available there. This is 1965. And he comes to Baltimore. And he became a good friend of mine. And he's a person, he could quote Shakespeare exactly, and he loved Shakespeare. Okay? So, and sometimes he'd speak about Shakespeare with the greatest level of, with all kinds of accolades. Shakespeare, one of a kind, this, that. So I said to him, by the way, I want to explain you something. You're not permitted, because you're not permitted to praise a non-Jew. And I explained it to him why. What the Rambam says, you could say, he writes, he one of a kind of a writer, although it's supposed to be he had a ghostwriter, Shakespeare. We don't know who wrote it, but it doesn't make a difference. But the moment you start esteeming and praising and revering this person, he has beliefs or values which are not in sync with Jewish values and beliefs. Therefore, you're not permitted. He says, I never heard of such a thing. See, and I said, why don't you go speak to the Mashgiach? We'll set you straight. I'm not the expert. Go speak to him. Goes to the Mashgiach, and he tells him, he says, I just can't help myself. I'm so enthralled with Shakespeare. I can't detach myself from my feeling of how I feel about him. So he said to him, this is what he said to him, 1965.
He said to him, if that's true, keep it to yourself. Don't share with others. That's all he said to him. Don't share with others. You have a problem. Hopefully, by not talking about it, it'll go away. Out of sight, out of mind. That's the way it works. Things, they die on their own. They just wither. But if you keep stoking the coals and always you're churning the emotion and stoking yourself, then you feel that special way about him. He says, don't talk about it. Keep it to yourself. Eventually it'll go away. That's what it's about. The teacher who teaches Torah, there's an obligation that a person has the ability to disseminate his knowledge to a third party who's a Jew. You have an obligation. That's Vishinantam Levanecha. Who are Banecha, your children? Talmidecha. The children that the Torah is referring to are your students. And the Gemara and Rambam cites a verse that we find that students of Torah are considered the children of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, the teacher, is like a father to the student. So my Rosh Hashiva, Zechat Tzarek Levrocha, blessed memory, asked, he says, if that's the case, if Bonecha means your students, what does there have to speak in this ambiguous context? Say clearly, you should teach your students. We have to say, Bonecha, your children mean your students. So say students. That's the question he asked. But the answer he gave wasn't his own answer. He said it over from Rav Chaim Brisker, Chaim Soloveitchik. He said, or maybe from the Alt of Slabodka, from Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zechat Tzarek Levrocha. What he said was like this. What a father would do for a son, for a child, a third party would not do for another person. Would not. A father will leave no stone unturned, do whatever he can to get through to a child or to communicate to a child or to impress upon a child a value. What the Torah is saying, when you disseminate Torah to your fellow Jew's child, the relationship has to be like father to son. Because if it's anything less than that, it's not going to be sufficiently communicated with that level of dedication. As a child, as a parent, wants only the best. And he'll repeat it 1,000 times if he has to. Because it's my child. Somebody else's child, up to a point. Beyond that point, I've already invested enough. Your own child, you don't give up on your own child. So by the Torah using the term, Bonecho, your sons, and we say, and sons mean the person who you mold through Torah is like your child. Now we understand what the thrust of your son means. As the son is what is the ultimate in your life, because I bring children into this world to raise them properly. Similarly, the Rebbe, the teacher, when he assumes that level of responsibility, it's no less than the father to a child. And therefore, he's in that role, being in that role, he has to have that level of dedication. Therefore, Torah says, you must teach your sons. However, there are differences. The Rambam writes, there's an obligation for a father to teach a son Torah. A chocham, what about if a father is not able to teach his son Torah? He has to hire a teacher, and it has to be delegated through a teacher. A person who's knowledgeable in Torah, and he masters his area. He has an obligation to share that Torah with a third party. That's only if he has time. Unless he's preoccupied, he's earning a living, or he's teaching his own children. Does he have an obligation to a third party's child? The answer is no. It's only if you have time available and you have Torah knowledge, you should disseminate it and share it with others. But if you don't have the time, because the time is not available, you have no obligation. So the question is, as the father, if he's not able to, must hire a teacher and
delegated through a teacher, why is the Chacham, if he has an obligation to teach a fellow Jew's child, he should hire a teacher to teach that third party's child, but yet he has no obligation. The difference is a father's obligation is to teach his son. It's not to impart knowledge, that the child should be the recipient of Torah knowledge. That's the obligation of a father to a child. A person who's a Chacham, meaning he has a knowledge base and he masters a certain area of Torah, that Torah you possess, you must share with others. That's only if I have time. If you have time available, you must. But if you don't have time available because you're preoccupied earning a living or raising your own family, because the emphasis is not to make sure the other party knows. It's what I have to share. A father's obligation to his child is I have to make sure, even if I'm an ignoramus, I have to do whatever I can to make sure my son has that knowledge. You're not able to impart it yourself, you're obligated to hire a teacher, that teacher should be the one, and that teacher is your agent. You're delegating through the agent, that agent represents who you are. It's very interesting. I had mentioned yesterday that if you have the lost article of your father or lost article of a teacher, the teacher's lost article to return takes precedence. Why? Because your father brings you into physical life and your teacher brings you into the spiritual world, the world to come. However, the Talmud says that's only a teacher who's Rabbi Muvak. Rabbi Muvak means a teacher, that he's your mentor, that the majority of your knowledge comes from that one person. Because that person molded you, spiritually speaking, okay? But if it's an ordinary teacher who taught you a year or so, with the majority of your knowledge is not due to that person, your father takes precedence over you, okay? Now the question is, what happens if that teacher with the majority of your knowledge comes from that one person? He only assumed that role because your father underwrote that education. That teacher is your father's agent. Being your father's agent, and we have a principle of Judaism, through agency, it's accredited to the one who commissions that agent. If that's the case, who's Rabbi Muvak? Who's the teacher, who's the equivalent, who molded and endowed upon that child or that person this perception, understanding of Torah? It's the father. Because the father paid for the education. So today, where you go to yeshiva and you study advanced level, if your parent pays tuition, and only because you're a student, because your tuition is being paid by them, therefore they provide that education, that Torah education, your father takes precedence at every level. Because that education is only due to your father's underwriting that education. So therefore the father's bringing the child l'chelem haba. It's only due to the father's financial support is the child making it to the world to come. Because otherwise he wouldn't have the teacher to teach him for that reason. At one time, not today anymore, but going back, I don't know, 50 years ago, when you went to study in Israel, the only thing maybe you had to pay for was room and board. For the Torah education, policy was we don't take money to teach Torah. Look, to feed you and to give you room, if we provide that, you pay because it costs us. But in terms of attending the lectures or providing the infrastructure to becoming a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, not only did you have to pay, even if you'd offer money to pay for it, they would not take it. You want to donate, make a donation to the yeshiva, that's fine. But to say we're taking tuition to underwrite it, we don't take it. We're not taking it. It's in that situation. If your father's agreeable to pay for your room and board, has nothing to do with the Torah. That's you're being taught. Your Rebbe who's teaching you is not the agent of the father. Today it's a whole different world. They pay, you pay for everything from A to Z and from Aleph to Tov. And if I have a few other alphabets, we'll include it into the other alphabets. You have to cover the full cost of whatever that is. No, the Rebbe has to pay insurance and he has to have a retirement fund and he has to have whatever it is. He has to have his vacation. And now with the gas going up in price, you know, you got to subsidize his gasoline. Otherwise, he couldn't get to the yeshiva and drive his car. And eventually, you know, the treads wear out. You got to buy him new tires. You know, there's no end to it. So everything is underwritten by the parent. That's the case. The parent is Rabbi Muvok, takes on that status of the mentor who molds and impacts on the child at that very special level.